welcome into the podcast. Man, last week's episode got so many listens. I was so excited about that on all the different platforms that we're on. Evidently, people are still curious about how Christians should properly respond to the controversy over those opening ceremonies at the Olympics. And of course, since then, at the Olympics, there has been a lot of controversy over the two athletes competing in women's boxing that have XY chromosomes. And a lot of people want to point out that the one individual was raised from birth as a girl, and there clearly seems to be some sort of genetic development problem there that I think nobody really knows the truth about. There's a lot of different speculation online about that. However, there's little doubt that having XY chromosomes gives that individual an unfair advantage, especially in a sport like boxing. And so my heart goes out to someone who has to deal with a genetic deformity like that all of their life. But we also have to make sure that we're not risking the lives of these female athletes by allowing this to happen as well. So today, we're not talking about the Olympics, though. Today, I want to talk about something that is becoming a massive problem in the U.S. and including U.S. churches, but really has been brought to the surface by a couple of recent events. And I want to dive into this issue of socialism. And many today would say that actually socialism is biblical. And they would say that the New Testament believers demonstrated it. And lately, what we've seen going on in culture is we've seen communists demonstrating in Philadelphia. And then our new Democrat vice president candidate has said this recently.
But we can get out there, reach out, make the case. And for one thing, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness.
So is socialism really just neighborliness? That sounds so friendly, doesn't it? But in the past, socialism has been seen as a very bad thing in America. It was understood that it's the economic path to communism, and it was understood that communism has been responsible for over 100 million deaths in the world. In a 2018 article from the Heritage Foundation, they reported a 2016 Harvard poll determined that 33% of Americans under 30 wanted socialism. In January 2016, YouGov asked millennials whether they had a favorable or unfavorable opinion of socialism, and 8% replied very favorable and 35% somewhat favorable. And for a total of 43%, almost the same percentage as in their 2017 survey. And so you've got under 30, 33% want it, and you've got millennials, which in many cases, many of them are over 30, you have them saying that 43% have a pretty favorable view of socialism. 43% of millennials are somewhat open to socialism, and that number is probably even way higher among Gen Z. And the interesting thing about all of this is that there are people telling us that the Bible actually supports socialism. So let's take a few minutes to talk about what it is and whether or not it's actually biblical. And as with a lot of these topics, man, I'm just telling you, your kids need to hear this. I know that a lot of times we live in separate worlds when it comes to digital media, and mom and dad like to listen to this, kids like to listen to that, but there's got to be some things that you sit down and say, hey, kids, I need you to listen to this and we're going to talk about it. And so very important that on these subjects, you're talking about this with your kids, at least maybe using this as a way to educate yourself so that you can know how to have the conversation. And so, trust me, your kids are being pumped full of propaganda on this stuff. And so you need to give them that biblical foundation that they need on this. And if you do, they're going to recognize the lies when they see it and be less likely to get sucked in to this thinking. And so, first of all, what is socialism? What is socialism? National Geographic's education website defines it this way. And I like this definition because it's, as much as it can be, it's a layman's terms kind of definition. It says socialism is, broadly speaking, a political and economic system in which property and the means of production are owned in common, typically controlled by the state or the government. So supposedly we've all agreed, although I'm not sure, well, yeah, I guess people have voted their way into socialism, but we've all agreed that we're not gonna own property and means of production on our own. Instead, we're gonna let that all be owned in common. And of course, that has to be governed some way, which means that the state actually is going to control it. Socialism, they go on to say, is based on the idea that common or public ownership of resources and means of production leads to a more equal society. So it's just better for everybody is the idea. And so that's why we're going to try this. Socialism is an attempt to resolve disparities in the standard of living between various groups of people. It can be between races of people, classes of people, people who run businesses and the people who work in them, but just resolving those disparities. On the surface, it seems like a great solution to struggles and pain that a lot of people face. It also seems like it's based on the idea of generosity. So it just seems like something that, maybe Christians can get on board with this. If a Christian is doing well in life, why would they not support having some of what they own or make taken, or maybe even all of it, in order to help out their fellow man who is not doing as well, as long as the state is going to take care of everybody, right? So why wouldn't Christians, be okay with that? Before we get into the biblical evidence, let's talk a little bit about the underlying ideas behind socialism. And I really encourage you to pick up my book, Christ and Culture, on Amazon for a more detailed explanation. There's an entire chapter about socialism in there, as well as some information about Marxism. But I would also encourage you to pick up the book from our sponsor today, Critical Dilemma. I would really encourage you to pick that up. It's going to be extremely helpful for this topic. So, socialism sees good and evil as a function of economics. If a person is not doing well financially, then they're not really responsible for their actions, or their actions are justified because the economic system has oppressed them. And so thus solutions that are proposed under socialism, listen, this is so important, never include personal responsibility, but rather more state control over the system in order to make it more fair. So if you have noticed that you hear more and more about the concepts of oppressed and oppressor lately, that is why. It's not just that some people are doing better than others. It's seen as active oppression. That the reason some people are doing better than others is because they've designed a system that holds the other people down. And so therefore people are not responsible for their decisions that may or may not have landed them in a tough situation. So the idea of everything being owned by the community, sounds really utopian, but it has to be managed by someone. And that's where Christians understand the nature of man becomes a problem. You've heard the phrase absolute power corrupts absolutely. That has never been more true than when you turn over all of the assets of a country to a few people. So one of the common complaints that supporters of socialism make against capitalism is that capitalism makes people greedy. Now, that's a Marxist philosophy, right? That Marxism tends to make the case that systems make man what he is. And so it's the only reason people are greedy is because of capitalism. But that's not really true, right? The problem is people do not become less greedy under socialism because we are naturally, apart from the work of God, we are sinful people all the time. So we're greedy whether or not we're under capitalism or socialism. And I think it was Thomas Sowell that said that there's nothing more greedy than saying, I deserve what someone else has worked for. In a 1979 interview on the Donahue Show, Milton Friedman asked, what system doesn't run on greed? And he made the case that the only system that has actually raised people out of poverty successfully has been capitalism. Capitalism at least provides checks and balances against corruption and abuse. Now think about this for a second. I think a lot of, especially Gen Z folks, are thinking, man, I see Congress trading stocks with insider information and getting super rich, and I see all this, and it's just, there's some seedy stuff going on. And yeah, because again, people are greedy, whether we're under socialism or capitalism. And they see CEOs that have, their company's been going down and they're stealing the money from the company and that stuff like that. But here's what happens under capitalism. The government and the economic system are separate enough. I think we've mixed them a little too much lately, but they're separate enough that that these people can be prosecuted for doing something like that, right? But what happens when the government controls all of that? And it's the government doing that, because guess what? They're also greedy. There's no one to hold them accountable. Okay, well, let's get into the case that people make saying that the Bible actually supports socialism, and let's see if they're being honest with the text. And people like to use these passages in the book of Acts, and this is a biblical principle, right? Like I'm one of the things I'm trying to do through this podcast is not just help you with understanding current events from a biblical worldview, but also help you understand how to understand the Bible. And one of the things that's important is that you have to be kind of careful in using things like the book of Acts or using narratives like, hey, this is just a story that we're telling, when they don't circle back and say, here's what you're supposed to understand from that story, or there's not passages later in just teaching texts that kind of corroborate it. You have to be careful looking at an example of a story and saying that's supposed to be what everyone's supposed to do for all time. So Acts is supposed to ignite our vision, our excitement for the Great Commission, that kind of thing, for what Jesus has called us to do. But I think we tend to go more to the epistles for this is actually what we're supposed to take away from the book of Acts. And so let's take a look at a couple of these passages. Acts chapter 2, verses 44 through 45. All the believers were together and had everything in common, and they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Wow. Okay. Acts chapter 4, 32 through 35. All the believers were one heart, in one mind, and no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them. They brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Man, like that, like on the surface, when you first read this, it's like, okay, the early church was practicing socialism. They shared everything they have. It was really beautiful. But let's dig a little deeper to understand what's going on here. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the concept of private property was actually maintained. What we don't see in these passages, and it almost sounds like it, but we don't see everyone signing everything over that they have to one collective ruling power. As people had need, others took from what they had and they helped them. The passages refer to their mindset. No one claimed any of their possessions was their own. My neighbors often will say to me, hey, listen, man, like I saw you rented a pressure washer. Like, don't do that, man. I've got a pressure washer. What's mine is yours. That's beautiful, man. But guess what? The pressure washer stays at their house, right? If I borrowed that and just kept it, all of a sudden, like what's mine is yours wouldn't actually, like that phrase doesn't mean that, right? That'd be a problem between me and my neighbor. So interestingly, they were still their possessions to choose to do with what they wanted. And actually, it's interesting. People want to point that Ananias and Sapphira, just after that passage in chapter 4 that I read, in chapter 5, they go and sell some land. And they come and they want kind of the credit that the other people were getting for selling land and bringing the money in. And so they go and sell some land, and they claim that they're bringing all the money from the sale of the land, but they're not. They're holding some of it back, and God strikes them dead. Man, that on the surface, people look at that and go, yeah, man, that God cared so much about people, living in this kind of socialist mindset that when they didn't do it right, God killed them. Well, that's not exactly how it worked. First of all, Peter says the problem is you lied. Right? Is you claim to be being generous at a certain level, but you're not. Like you didn't actually bring all of the money from the sale. But then he says something super interesting. He says, wasn't it all like yours to do with as you wanted? So in other words, nobody forced you to do this. You weren't required to do this. God's not upset that you sold the land or you didn't bring all the sale of the land to Peter. What he's saying is you chose to do this. You did this on your own volition and then chose to make a big deal out of it and lie about it. So it's interesting. That's actually the problem in that passage. And so the idea of personal possessions and private property is continued to be maintained in these passages in Acts. The very fact that the Bible talks about the sins of stealing and envy and coveting demonstrates that God places a value on private property. Obviously, Leviticus is full of laws and instructions on how God wants violations of private property to be dealt with. Now, we talk about this again as an interpretation, biblical interpretation principle. Those are laws that God gave to Israel for their nation, right? It's not prescriptive of every nation. Every nation doesn't necessarily have to follow the same laws, but they do show that God seems to honor private property. The second thing is this: these acts are voluntary. These acts are done out of the kindness of their hearts, not forced by the government. And that is one very huge difference of supreme importance. I will touch more on this in a minute, but it's voluntary, right? There is accountability. And that's the way it is when you are voluntarily giving, when you determine that somebody has a need, when you work hard to obtain private possessions, and then you direct some of the resources that you have to bless somebody else. There's always going to be accountability. We're going to be careful to evaluate the needs and make sure that there truly is a need there, and it's being used in a way that will truly help that person rise out of their struggles. So that's just natural when giving is voluntary. So when sharing is voluntary, needs are met more efficiently. It doesn't dissuade people from working to get ahead, which we're going to talk about that in a minute, which enables more cash flow to bless others. Socialism discourages people to work and to get ahead, which naturally means that the cash flow will definitely go down and eventually everyone is going to be out of money. So these acts were voluntary. These acts also took place in a very unusual economic situation, and this is something that people don't talk about enough. The people in need here have just become Christ followers in a deeply religious Jewish society. The Jews were very sure they had the right religion. What other God had done what theirs had done? What other God had taken 2 million people out of slavery like this? And they didn't just escape out of slavery and then somebody gave some invisible God credit for it. God actively worked miracle after miracle to make it happen. And then God's powerful presence came down on Mount Sinai and gave Israel God's word. God gave them the exact way that they were to worship him. And so they knew they had the one true God. They knew they had his word, and they knew that they were worshiping him the way that they were supposed to. So you can imagine when Jesus came and his followers started saying, hey, he rose from the dead and he should be worshiped, that there was a massive amount of pushback. Of course, the key to their claims was the fact that Jesus actually did, in fact, rise from the dead. But clearly, with that much certainty and tradition ingrained in their nation and in their culture, this was too much of a shift for a lot of people. And they just failed to see that this was actually the fulfillment of everything that they had already been told. In that context, the Jewish people a lot of times shunned these new Christ followers. They were often disowned by their families. They were fired from their jobs. They didn't have a home to live in anymore, leaving them destitute and no immediate way to get back on their feet. And I think this situation kind of reminds us a little bit of like the COVID-19 outbreak, right? That all of a sudden, a lot of people got laid off, and all of a sudden they couldn't meet their bills, and all of a sudden they were possibly going to lose their houses. And what do we see? We saw things like in churches, small groups coming together and saying, hey, here's one of our small group members that needs us to meet their needs, making sure that they had the necessities that they needed while they looked for new employment. And so this is the kind of thing that was going on at that time. So this is not a long-term governmental structure that was being established. It was something that was put in place to kind of help these people get their basic needs met until people were able to meet them themselves. However, this did go on for some time. The apostles regularly collected offerings to send back to the believers in Jerusalem because that was probably the place where those people were most likely to financially suffer for their faith. So the fact is that this is actually a good argument against socialism. The fact that it couldn't support itself, that eventually it seems that the generous, wealthy believers in Jerusalem were not able to keep up with the needs. So churches from around the world were now outside of their culture, were having to help meet those needs. In other words, as a long-term system, this doesn't work mathematically. Believers were always going to struggle to be well received by their employers in that culture. And so Jesus had told the believers in Jerusalem to do what? He said, go into all the world and spread the gospel. Maybe they should have just done that, right? Maybe most of the believers that couldn't find a way to support themselves should have just moved on to spread the gospel in other places, and that would have opened up employment opportunities elsewhere. Well, we're going to continue to hit on these biblical observations and principles on this issue right after this short break.
I'm Dr. Neil Shenby.
And I'm Dr. Pat Sawyer.
We're so excited to tell you about our new book, Critical Dilemma. It'll help you understand critical social theories like critical race theory and queer theory from a Christian perspective.
Pre-order now at christianbook.com.
Welcome back. Let's get back to these observations from these passages in Acts that are used to supposedly prove that socialism was endorsed by the early church. And so the next thing I want to talk about is this. These acts were done in a very accountable, tight-knit community. I've kind of alluded to that already, but this was not a public handout program. Not that Christians don't need to worry about being generous to the general public, but these passages are poor justification for public government programs. This was Christians taking care of real needs that they observed in their friends' lives. They knew that this person lost their job. They knew this family was put out of his home. This person was put out of his home by his family. They knew that this widow was no longer going to be taken care of by her family because of her new faith. They knew what would happen with the money that was shared. They knew that those funds were going to necessities. Now, Christians obviously would want to be generous to their overall community, but this concept of accountability is still really important in order to ensure good stewardship and maximum effectiveness. We see a legacy of this kind of generosity in many nations where Christianity is dominant. In American history, churches created hospitals, ran the education system, started colleges, and helped the poor. And all of that was done with personal accountability. People were expected to do what they could for themselves. Unfortunately, the Great Depression overwhelmed what could be taken care of privately, and the government began to take over many of these programs. Now, despite that, Christians should continue to be voluntarily generous in ways that will lift up people who are struggling in their communities, but still with accountability. And then the next thing I want to talk about is this. These acts were not designed to bring equal outcomes, but to provide help to those who were struggling to meet their basic needs. Using these passages to support socialism breaks down because the money was not shared so that everyone could have the exact same lifestyle. Craig Blomberg, in his book, Neither Poverty Nor Riches, says, interestingly, what does not appear in this paragraph is any statement of complete equality among believers. The goal was to meet basic needs until they had the opportunity to improve their situation. The goal was not to make sure that there were no more wealthy Christians and there were no more poor Christians. Now, some people may have given so generously that they were no longer wealthy, but that was their choice. But the goal was not forced equity, and it's important to understand that. Now, we'll come back to that term in just one second. The last thing I just kind of want to drive home is the Bible regularly promotes personal financial responsibility. Listen to these passages. In Ephesians 4:28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. Stop the sin that you're doing. Stop the wrong choices that you're making and take responsibility. And he says, but you must work so you begin to be a responsible, productive citizen doing something useful with our own hands, it says, that you may have something to share with those in need. So Paul says, I want you to take so much personal responsibility, put yourself in the right position through hard work so that you can actually begin to bless other people. 2 Thessalonians 3:10 says, for even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. I mean, wow, right? The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. Paul says, I will watch you starve if you're not willing to get up and work. I'm not going to bail you out. Like that's strong language. 1 Timothy 5:8, also strong language. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Acts 20:35. In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Then when we get into Proverbs 12:24, it says, diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. He says, when you're diligent and you work hard, you're going to position yourself in a much better situation. But laziness ends in that culture in working for somebody else. In our culture, that's not true. In our culture, you can just go bankrupt. If your income is below a certain level, we will help you in any way, even though you are not diligent. Proverbs 13:4. A sluggard's appetite is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. And then it kind of goes along with Proverbs 13:19. A longing fulfilled is sweet to the soul, but fools detest turning from evil. Those last two passages really just kind of come with this idea of we're designed to feel so good when we have worked hard and accomplished something. That's how God has designed us. So the Bible is clear. We should work hard to take care of our own needs. The Bible denies the concept that equity should be enforced. Notice the shift that we have in our culture today from that we're now talking using the term equity away from the historical American value of equality. And it's on purpose because it's part of the Marxist brainwashing of our culture. Equality is a biblical value. Every person is equal in God's eyes. We're all, a person who is created in the image of God. Every person should have the same opportunity. If we're respecting they're not respecter of persons, that kind of thing. Everyone should have the same opportunity to pursue their own advancement. Now, that doesn't mean that a person will never run into a person who tries to hold them back or discriminates against them. To be honest, at some point, every person faces something that is unfair. Every person does. In many cases, there are laws that enable a person to take legal action when that happens. But there definitely shouldn't be systems, rules, or laws in place that discriminate against particular people. And in our culture today, we don't have that, right? So that's equality, but you hear Marxists talk about equity. And the only way to enforce equity is for the government to have more control. So we should work hard for our advancement so that we can be able to bless others. And if we don't, we're personally responsible for the results. No one owes us anything to bail us out if we are not willing to work hard. Paul says, I guess that you're just not going to be eating, right? Maybe that growling stomach will motivate you to become a more responsible person. Now, person who loses their job and they're taking side jobs and doing everything they can do to earn any money at all while they're also looking for a job, like that person needs help, right? They should definitely be helped. And that's something that as Christians we should step into. Really, it would be great if Christians were doing that and the government was doing none of it. No, I don't think you can possibly make the case from the Bible that God endorses socialism. Guess what? If it goes against principles that God has laid out in Scripture, we can expect it not to be very effective. In fact, we can expect it to be bad for mankind. And that's exactly what we see. Even in countries that have been called democratic socialist states, they are seeing that the money is running out and that it's not working. Referring to Sweden, foreignpolicy.com reports as a result of the shift away from low tax policies. Okay, so they in this article, they had originally been talking about how that for decades, Sweden's economy was booming. And then they began to head towards this more socialist focus, and they shifted away from low tax policies to extremely high tax policies, but the government's going to take care of everybody's needs, right? And so it says, he goes on to say, economic growth stagnated when they made that shift. He says, over the past 50 years, for instance, Swedish GDP per capita has only grown by a factor of 2.1 in 50 years. More importantly, the norms relating to hard work and responsibility have started to erode. What did we say, right? We said that what happens is that when people are not motivated to go out and work hard because they realize you can't possibly get ahead. And so he says, as welfare has increased, that's what has happened. It says, because it was becoming obvious that these more socialist policies were not working, many Nordic nations are now becoming much more free market focused in their economies. Of course, as Americans, we are just arrogant enough to believe that no one has quite tried it correctly yet. And we're going to be the ones to do it, even though the entire idea goes against what God says about how human nature works. So socialism does not work mathematically. It is not a biblical concept. It has always ended badly. Just talking about Sweden, like economically, it's ended badly. Luckily, it hasn't turned into dictatorships and absolute power corrupting, that kind of thing. But in many cases, it has ended violently in a lot of nations. And we're kind of seeing that in Venezuela right now. I think that we're at a point in America where it is extremely important to get educated on this issue and to make sure the next generation understands it both economically and biblically. So that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining me. Make sure that you share the podcast with someone else. Go back and catch up on old episodes as well, and we'll see you next Friday.